a really big thing that changed the way I use spreadsheets in general, but crop planning in specific, was when I discovered pivot tables. And this is actually New Year's Eve. At a New Year's Eve party, I was sitting down with somebody, wild party, as you can imagine, and my buddy Sil told me about pivot tables. Said, Dan, do you know about pivot tables? And he tried to explain them to me, and he said, just check them out when you get home. So I got home, and I looked at pivot tables, and it turned out to be kind of like the missing piece of what I needed for crop planning spreadsheets and spreadsheets in general. Welcome to episode 48 of the Seed Farmer Podcast. The podcast where I want you to harvest seeds from some of the vegetables and flowers growing in your farm or garden, and then to plant that seed out to grow delicious vegetables and beautiful flowers. I'm your host, Dan Brisebois, seed grower at Tournesol Cooperative Farm and author of The Seed Farmer, a complete guide to growing, using, and selling your own seeds. If you enjoy the Seed Farmer podcast and find it to be a good resource that helps you improve your seed work and farming, please support the show at spreadsheet.farm/support podcast. Today's mini-sode is all about crop planning. But first, some news. A couple episodes ago, I'm not really sure which episode, in the news, I talked about the piment végétarien, so a vegetarian pepper. I'm not sure the exact English name, but it gets called piment végétarien in French fairly regularly. This is a Capsicum chinensis pepper that's from Guadeloupe that my co-farmer Abib shared with me and that we grew out this summer. Capsicum chinensis is the same family as habaneros and Scotch bonnets and some really, really hot peppers. But the piment végétarien, though they're in the same family, or I guess I should say the same species, they're actually quite mild. When you eat them, you can taste that edge where it might get hot, but it just doesn't get hot. So it's really fun. Now, if you listen to that previous news, in whatever episode it was, you'll remember that I mentioned that there was an accident and Abib had actually accidentally crossed them with some Carolina Reapers, which are some phenomenally hot peppers. So when we harvested the peppers, we discovered that not all of them could be called mild at all. And Abib actually tasted one that left a real mark on him for the next half hour. He was kind of impressed, being somebody who can handle pretty spicy food. Anyways, I had a dozen selections from those peppers that were based on heat level, yield, flavor, fruit shape. And I had essentially put all the fruit from one plant in one bag and another fruit from a plant in another bag in brown paper bags that I had written notes about selection on the bags. And so this was done way back in October. And then I let those bags sit in my shed for 10 weeks and just did, it was a little bit of procrastination. And then I started to be worried, what are those fruit going to look like? Peppers don't necessarily sit well for 10 weeks and still look good. And finally, I got to them as like the first day of the holidays. That's what I did. And many of the fruit was shriveled and dried. None of it was like rotten. There was sometimes a little bit of rot in some of the shriveled ones, but they were still looking fairly well. And about 20% were still fresh. And I was really impressed to see some fresh peppers 10 weeks later at room temperature. Peppers really impressed me. So I harvested the seed, or I extracted the seed from all the selections, and I put them in different little envelopes with the notes that were on the brown bag, gave them different numbers so that I could keep track of it in the future, put it into a spreadsheet, of course. But I chose 5 of those selections to grow out next year. All of them were mild. I'm not going to grow anything with heat. That's not the point of this pepper. I was really aiming for mild. One of the ones I chose was the one my co-farmer Fred loved the most. And I chose it because he loved it. So, the flavor was there. It also happened to be the best yielding one. So that's a double plus for that. I eliminated any that we had noted tasted bitter or didn't taste good, even if they were mild. So 3 of the 5 I selected based on yield. And then there were 2 and I should say the 3 of the 5 that were selected based on yield, Abib said didn't look as much like the piment végétarien as he was expecting it. And maybe that's a little bit of crossing with the Reaper. I don't know. I don't know if that means there's some hidden hot genes in there. But I did want to keep at least 2 that looked more like the piment végétarien that he was expecting. even if they were low yielding. So I chose the 2 mildest that we like the flavor the most to grow out, and the best yielding of the low yielding. So 5 selections for my crop plan for next year. And we'll grow 10 plants of each of those next year, so 50 plants total. It's not a lot, but it's going to give us an idea of what they're like. We'll see whether we've able to eliminate that accidental heat with that one crossing, or maybe it's not even in there. So that's a 2026 project that I'm excited about. And talking about projects, in episode 45, where Julia Shanks and I talked about submitting our next book, The Profitable Farmer, to our publisher. So that's coming out in September 2026. A little plug there. But at the end of that episode, I asked for listeners to submit any projects that they may have brought to completion this year. And so I got I got an email from Shane, and I'll read it off to you. Hi, Dan. Happy holidays. In your last podcast, you had mentioned if listeners had any projects or things they had done this year to let you know about them. Well, I guess mine would be software I'm calling Permastead. It is geared towards running a household or homestead, and the name is an amalgamation of permaculture and homesteading. I'm studying herbalism now, so I have also some features for that crowd as well, namely the plant database doubling as a materia medica. Right now, it is an alpha, but I hope to get a first release out in 2026. I have been actively testing it for a couple years, and it works well for me, but I'm not sure the workflow will resonate with others. The app is free, and below is a link, and I'll put the link in the show notes, but there's a link to the GitHub as well as a quick description. Anyway, I wish you the best in 2026, and good luck with the new book. Best wishes, Shane. All right. So if you have any projects that you brought to completion in 2025 that you're proud and want to tell people about, definitely feel free to share them with me too. And now let's get into today's mini-sode topic. Today's episode is all about crop planning with spreadsheets. The first thing I guess I should say is, what is crop planning? Crop planning is figuring out what you're going to grow in the coming season. What crops, what varieties, how much of each, and when you're going to plant them, and where you're going to plant them. And you want to do that before the growing season, because if you do it during the growing season, that overlaps into the world of crisis management, and that is never fun on a farm. So crop planning is figuring out what you're going to grow this coming growing season. And I've been interested in crop planning just about as long as I've been farming. When I started working on organic farms in the summer of 2000, I was always curious how the farmers I was working with or working for figured out what they were going to grow. A lot of it was intuitive. Some of it they were doing based on previous year's records. But so this is 2000, right? Early 2000s. None of them were using spreadsheets to plan out what they were doing. And I started to keep track of, on the farms that I worked for, keep track of what we were growing, when we were harvesting it, how much we were growing it, all of that. And then when I was working for Alison Hackney at La Ferme du Fort Sainte-Ville in Montreal, the West Island of Montreal, Alison shared with me some crop planning spreadsheets that were designed by Dan Kaplan. And they really impressed me because it was kind of what I was sort of looking for. And I started off with his sheets and then modified them and created a system. So based on what I had been keeping track of on different farms for the previous years and seeing what the results were, and then using the spreadsheets, I kind of put together my own spreadsheet system. And that's what we were using. That's what we used when we started Turn a Soul Cooperative Farm in 2005. And by then, it had become fairly smooth and fairly clear to figure out what to grow based on your sales needs. And then over the next couple years, kind of fine-tuning the system, my co-farmer Fred Terrio and I, we systematized it, and we wrote a book about it called Crop Planning for Organic Vegetable Growers. And in that book, we broke down this crop planning system into 11 steps, and starting with your financial goals and then working backwards to figure out what you needed to do to have enough of that. Figuring out your sales plan, then figuring out what you were growing in the field, then figuring out your greenhouse starts, and then figuring out your seed order. So that's how we set up the book. When we wrote that book, we were using spreadsheets, but we made a decision not to include spreadsheets much in the book because I didn't feel they were as good as they could be. Like, they were fine, but they relied on a lot of copy pasting. And copy pasting can be dangerous. And the system that we had at that point worked as well in spreadsheets, or even if you were doing it by paper, which a lot of people were still doing at that point. And so we published this book, and a lot of people read it. A lot of people based their crop planning on it. But that's not where my crop planning ended. I just kept tweaking those sheets. And one of the things I really wanted was to not have to copy paste information from one place to another, but rather to have things flow into each other. And a really big thing that changed the way I use spreadsheets in general, but crop planning in specific, was when I discovered pivot tables. And this is actually, I don't know if it's like 2011 or 2012, but it was actually New Year's Eve. At a New Year's Eve party, I was sitting down with somebody, wild party, as you can imagine, and my buddy Sil told me about pivot tables. Said, Dan, do you know about pivot tables? And he tried to explain them to me, and he said, just check them out when you get home. So I got home, and I looked at pivot tables, and it turned out to be kind of like the missing piece of what I needed for crop planning spreadsheets and spreadsheets in general. And when folks learn about pivot tables who don't know about them, it will take your spreadsheet knowledge to the next level. And I do have a number of videos about pivot tables. There's one the latest one that I released a year or two ago is in the show notes. You can go there and check out and learn about pivot tables and have your mind blown and your mind expanded and your spreadsheet life better. So anyway, pivot tables was the last piece to really get the spreadsheets together. Now, I have a basic crop plan spreadsheet that you can download for free if you go to spreadsheet.farm/BCP. That's for Better Crop Plan, BCP. The link is also in the show notes. And you'll see essentially how I integrated the crop planning system that we had in Crop Planning for Organic Vegetable Growers, the book, into one spreadsheet that you could then use pivot tables to create planting schedules for your field, for your greenhouse, for your nursery, for your seed order. And for many of you listening, this is all you need for your crop planning. But that isn't where my crop planning ended. I created a much more complex spreadsheet system, which has many spreadsheets that are linked together. And this is actually what I include in my course, Farm Spreadsheets for All Seasons. And we use a modified version of these sheets at Turner Soul. And that's one thing that's nice about using spreadsheets is you can modify them for your own particular needs. The more complex system is a bit harder to modify. For those who really want to, they're able to, but I have a more complex spreadsheet system for those folks who just really want to go further in all their planning. The main difference is you start off by defining the dimensions of your fields, how many beds they are, assigning block numbers to them. You also then define all the crops that you're going to grow, and the spacing, the days to maturity, all the different things related to them, the yield that you expect. You can also set up different parameters based on whether they're going to be grown in a greenhouse or in the field, and whether they're growing in the winter or the summer. You can choose when those parameters work. So you set up your basics in a couple sheets, and then the crop plan spreadsheets will reference those. They also can go a lot more in depth with planning out your sales season by week, by outlet with these more complex systems. That was something that's a little bit limiting, that I couldn't get into one spreadsheet, so I don't have it in the basic, but I have it in the more complex system. Then you have your full spreadsheet, and then you can create, with these templates, it creates field maps of where everything is in your field and how long they should be in different beds over the growing season. And that's the basics of the crop planning part of the spreadsheet. Then there's also a set of spreadsheets for harvest management. So you have your crop planning sheets. Then as you plant, you can log what you've actually planted. So the actuals are not always the same as the plan. And then based on what you've actually planted, you can do a weekly field walk, and the spreadsheet has what you should be expecting to come each week of the year. And then you can kind of decide, or not decide, during your field walk, you figure out what actually came. And then using the harvest management sheets, you can create a pack list, and you can create your sales sheets and link those together. And the last part of the spreadsheet brings everything together. So it looks first at what's in the field, what you planned on planting and what you actually planted. And then what you planned on harvesting and actually harvested, and what you planned on selling and actually sold. And then you can see your dollars per crop and your dollars per bed foot. You can see your yields, and all that information gives you a really good snapshot of the growing season. It also gives you a really good starting point for next year's crop plan. And then for next year's crop plan, you just make a copy of these sheets, and then you go in and tweak them for how you want to change them for the following year. So that's the more complete spreadsheet system that is part of Farm Spreadsheets for all seasons. For folks who want to go a little bit further than what's in those basic spreadsheets, and there's some people that just want to use the crop planning part of these complex sheets, and then some people use the harvest. I found a lot of folks really, they want to get to the point of knowing when to plant and how much to plant, and making sure they start their seedlings in the nursery at the right time. I find a lot of people are happy to get to that point, and they just ignore the harvest stuff, and they're happy to go into the year and do their stuff. And then other people really love having the full, complete piece. That's essentially what's in my crop planning spreadsheets. Do you need to understand spreadsheets to take this course? It helps a bit, but you don't really, because the course comes with a full set of crop planning templates where the spreadsheets are already set up, so you don't have to build your own spreadsheets. The formulas are all there. The formulas are in blue. The non-formulas, I guess, are in black. You can edit what you want. There's both a blank set of templates, and then there's an example set of templates with you can see the math behind it in it. And you can start with either of them to do your own crop plan. And there's a number of videos that walk you through each step of the process from beginning to end. And then I'm always available by email to support you if you get stuck somewhere. And then we have live sessions every 2 weeks through March, so you can ask your questions in person, because sometimes it's not so easy to get a good answer about a spreadsheet by email. So in the live sessions, that's a really good way to get an idea or to go further into figuring out whatever is challenging you with either your crop planning or else your spreadsheet. Now, I know these days there's increasing numbers of crop planning apps out there, and if you're using them and love them, that's fantastic. But if you haven't settled on a crop planning system yet, and you're trying to think about, do you want to go for spreadsheets? Do you want to go for apps? I mean, as you can tell, I'm definitely biased towards spreadsheets, but some of the things that I like of crop planning spreadsheets versus apps is that apps have recurring costs. And so you're just paying continuously forever. Crop planning spreadsheets, once you've set them up, they're there, and you just modify them as you wish, and you don't have to worry about recurring costs. Crop planning apps are not always flexible to your specific needs. You might find that your farm you don't think about your farm the same way that the crop planning app thinks about your farm. Spreadsheets are a lot more flexible than apps are. You can kind of modify them as you wish. And one thing about a crop planning app is that it's often just someone else's spreadsheet that's behind a user interface, so you can't see the formulas. So you're using a spreadsheet anyway, you just don't know necessarily how the math is happening. So those are some of the reasons that I like using a spreadsheet versus an app, and that kind of fits me, and it might fit you too. Now, these crop planning spreadsheets can be used for market growers and market gardeners to plan out, your CSA, your farmer's market, your farm stall, all the crops that you're growing. They can also be used for cut flower growers to plan out all the flowers that you wish, and they can be used for seed farmers too. Basically, any annual crop that you're growing fits well into these spreadsheets. And this is, as I was saying earlier, these are the sheets that we use at Turn a Soul, and we're using them for vegetables, flowers, and also for seed crops. Now, I wanted to wrap up by sharing someone's experience with these spreadsheets, and this actually comes from the August 2024 issue of Growing for Market magazine. So when I opened that issue, and actually I should say when Emily opened that issue, she said, "Hey, Dan, your spreadsheets are in Growing for Market." And I came and looked, and there they were. There's a screenshot of kind of the core sheet. It was right on the front cover of the magazine, and I was thrilled to see that. And there was an article called Prevent Summer Decision Fatigue with Planning by Dan Perkins. And in that article, Dan talks about different management tools that they use on their farm, of which there are the Farmer Spreadsheet Academy crop planning spreadsheets. And this is what he said about those sheets. So he says, "I'm a fan of spreadsheets and have developed a good system over the years, but I always felt I could do better, wanting a system that would cover the entire year and coordinate finances, planting, harvesting, and record keeping all in one system. I found that system 2 years ago in Farm Spreadsheet Academy by Dan Brisebois. It allows me to plan each week of the year's production, harvest, field maps, and records based on specific financial goals. This process gives me a step-by-step process that reduces the number of decisions I need to make about crop planning. I can do this while sipping my tea and the snow is blowing outside, which actually makes it enjoyable." So that's what Dan wrote about the Farmer Spreadsheet Academy crop planning sheets in Growing for Market magazine. I was thrilled to see that. It's always fun to hear about folks using your systems in ways that help support their farm. Now, I guess it's time for you to go out and do your own crop planning. If you want to use any of the Farmer Spreadsheet Academy sheets, you can go find the links in the show notes below. And as I mentioned, there is a set that's a free basic sheet that will probably meet many of your needs. And then there's also the spreadsheets as part of Farm Spreadsheet for all seasons for those of you who need more spreadsheets in your life. And that's another episode of the Seed Farmer Podcast. Thank you to Sophia Sid-Dalton for the theme music. You can hear more of their music at sophiasidlalton.com. Thank you to Molly Brisebois for editing this episode, and thank you so much for listening. You can find more seed growing resources on my blog at seedgrowers.farm. While you're there, you can subscribe to my newsletter full of seed growing, crop planning, and farm spreadsheets. You can also find out where to order a copy of my book, The Seed Farmer, A Complete Guide to Growing, Using, and Selling Your Own Seed. And you can support the podcast at spreadsheet.farm/supportpodcast. If you haven't already subscribed to this podcast, now's the time. You wouldn't want to miss the next episode. Until then, happy farming.